put that wrinkled hand down. Old man, this is SEAL training, not a nursing home, the instructor shouted, his hand slapping hard against Caleb Ross's shoulder before driving a kick straight into his chest, forcing him to stumble back one step. The young recruits burst into loud laughter when they noticed the faded eagle tattoo on his arm. An eagle? Huh? One of them sneered. Probably got it after a few drunk nights in Saigon. A piece of trash bragging about a fake past. They laughed, spat onto the sand, and ground their boots over the tattoo. Caleb remained silent and slowly rolled his sleeve higher, fully revealing the eagle and the faint row of numbers beneath it. Something no one in this entire unit understood, except for one person. But only a few seconds later, as the whistle for formation pierced the air and the training field gates swung open, the base commander stepped inside. The moment his eyes caught that tattoo, he froze, his face draining of color. In front of hundreds of staring eyes, the SEAL commander snapped to attention and raised his hand in a formal salute, directed at the useless old man the group had just humiliated. Lieutenant Colonel Caleb Ross, he pronounced each word, his voice dry and final like an execution order. Sealed operation insignia, codename Night Eagle. Who permitted you to lay a hand on this man? If you were Caleb, after being turned into a joke in the middle of the field, would you lower your head and stay silent? Or would you tear apart the entire system that just trampled you? Comment your answer, subscribe to the channel, and watch how that so-called worthless tattoo drags the entire SEAL base down into hell. The Grand Hyatt Washington ballroom glowed with light, chandeliers reflecting down onto rows of perfectly aligned chairs, a massive screen behind the stage, flashing slogans about the future of veterans and promises that sounded noble at first glance. The front rows were filled with new suits, polished shoes, name badges, crowded with titles and sponsor logos. Farther back, a smaller seating area marked by a sign reading, Veterans Open Seating was pushed tight against a column, a direction few bothered to look toward. Elias Hawthorne sat in the middle row, back straight, both hands resting on a cloth-bound notebook. His gray suit had faded with age, and a simple paper badge clipped to his pocket read Elias H., with the word veteran beneath it. To those around him, he was merely an old veteran attending out of obligation, the kind of guest every conference needed to appear inclusive. No one connected this silent man to the Major General, who had once signed off on the very proposals that laid the foundation for the veteran support programs now being showcased as conference achievements. On the stage, Gregory Vance stood at the podium, microphone set at the perfect height, his smile carefully practiced. He spoke of turning points, of vision, of figures meant to prove the system was moving in the right direction. Each time Vance paused for emphasis, the moderator immediately cued the room, and the entire hall responded with synchronized applause. With a click of the remote, the slide behind him shifted to a chart. Blue bars surged upward, and the title at the top of the screen clearly read, Record Employment Rate for Veterans. At the bottom of the chart, in tiny footnote text, buried among symbols, appeared the phrase Registered Outcomes. Vance turned halfway toward the screen. One hand opened wide in presentation. As you can see, he said, never before have so many veterans been employed. This is the result of years of reform and collaboration. We are making history with these programs. In the back section, Elias did not clap. He stared at the small line of text beneath the chart, narrowed his eyes, and read it slowly. The words Registered Outcomes formed in his mind, like a muted version of the real story. He lifted his hand from the notebook. The aged arm rose, slow and straight. For a few seconds, no one on stage noticed. Then the moderator glanced toward the veterans section, saw the raised hand, and smiled. Yes, we have a question from the veteran seating area in the back, the moderator said. Please go ahead. Sir, kindly introduce yourself and ask your question. Elias stood, lightly bracing himself on the back of the chair in front of him. His voice was low and clear. My name is Elias Hawthorne, he said. I have a question about the chart that was just shown. Several heads in the middle rows turned. Gregory Vance gave a small nod, his smile still perfectly in place. It is an honor to hear from a veteran, he replied. Please, go ahead. Elias looked at the screen, then back toward the podium. May I ask, he said, whether that record employment rate for veterans is calculated based on program registrations or on the number of people who are actually employed, receiving wages, and holding contracts. His words pulled a thin layer of silence across the room. Someone leaned down and whispered to a colleague, another data nitpicking question. The colleague replied quietly, don't worry, they will gloss over it. Vance looked down but avoided the footnote text. We base our figures on aggregated reports from states and partner organizations, he said. The numbers have been reviewed and are highly reliable. What matters is not individual cases, but the overall picture showing that the program is operating effectively. Elias remained standing. Then what is the actual unemployment rate among veterans at present? He continued. And how many are still without work this year? This time, several chairs turned fully around. A young woman from a recruitment group leaned toward her friend. That question sounds uncomfortable. The colleague shrugged. Vance will probably redirect. I think, Vance said, that we should avoid getting lost in technical details during the opening session. Today, we are focusing on vision and long-term commitments. Detailed figures, when separated from context, can easily cause misunderstanding. If you wish, my team will be happy to address this with you privately after the program. If the vision overlooks those sitting outside the statistics, Elias replied, then perhaps the specific numbers are the real context. The sentence landed without applause. The moderator stepped in. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne, for your direct question, he said. We will note it for the data discussion segment later. For the sake of time, may I ask you to take your seat so the program can continue? Elias nodded. He sat down, opened his notebook, and took out an old ballpoint pen. The tip touched the paper and began to move, not writing full sentences, but scattered phrases. Record employment rate, aggregated reports, technical details, vision, context, private clarification. On the stage, Vance moved on to another slide, his voice once again smooth as he spoke about digital platforms and corporate connections. The audience resumed its half-hearted applause. The question about the real unemployment rate hung somewhere in the air, unspoken and unanswered. If a camera had drifted away from Vance's brightly lit face and panned down to the veteran's seat, it would have stopped on the wrinkled hand resting on the notebook. Each stroke of Elias's pen marked a promise just spoken. Up close, he looked like a man counting, carefully recording each unit of commitment, to be opened one day again and used to demand full payment from those on the stage. That afternoon, the conference moved into its specialized discussion sessions. The directory board in the hallway was filled with text, listing topics such as technology and public-private partnerships, with the most prominent being the room titled Budget and Vocational Training Funds for Veterans. This was the place where numbers were put on display once again, but also where the gaps behind them were most easily exposed. Elias walked into that room and chose his familiar seat in the second row. He placed his notebook on the folding table and looked up at the panel of chairs on the dais. Gregory Vance still sat in the center, wearing a different colored tie but retaining the same air of confidence. Beside him were a financial representative and a young aide whose hand never left the already open laptop. The presenter was a young woman wearing thin glasses, holding a presentation remote. She spoke quickly and without hesitation about last year's disbursement rate, about the number of contracts signed, about new training programs that were implemented on schedule. Each time she mentioned a figure, she pressed the button, and a bar on the chart appeared higher than the previous year. The Federal Vocational Training Fund is being used effectively, she concluded. Most resources have reached the correct target groups at the right stage of employment transition. The moderator stepped up to replace her, smiling as he looked around. We will now move to the question and answer portion, he said. We very much hope to hear from the veterans in the room. No one spoke immediately. A few people twirled their pens, and others looked down at printed materials, pretending to read carefully. Then Elias's hand rose again, slow but firm. Yes, sir. The moderator gestured toward him. You appear to be Mr. Hawthorne from the morning session. Elias stood up. He did not introduce himself again, only looked straight at the panel. I want to ask about time, he said. How long does it take for the Federal Vocational Training Fund to reach veterans after their applications are approved? The question sounded mild, but it caused the entire front row to fall silent for a beat. Vance leaned toward the microphone, maintaining a polite smile. As we have presented, he replied, we always strive to disperse funds within a reasonable time frame. No one is forgotten. Specifically, how long? Elias continued evenly. 3 months, 6 months, or several years. A small ripple of laughter came from the corporate seating area. A young man leaned toward his colleague and spoke loudly enough for several nearby rows to hear. Does the old man think this is a service counter? He smirked. Federal budgets do not come with delivery deadlines of 3 to 5 days. The laughter stopped quickly and then disappeared entirely. No one at the panel joined in. Vance tapped his finger against the microphone, his eyes no longer smiling. "We cannot personalize every case," he said. "Some files are complete and processed quickly. Others require additional verification or get stuck in local coordination. Each case has its own reasons, but surely you still have an average figure," Elias said, "because earlier you explained very clearly all those impressive percentages to us. On average, how long must a veteran wait from the moment their file is marked approved until they actually receive training and support?" In the back rows, a young veteran lowered his head further. He felt the question rise from deep in his own gut. His email clearly said approved. The notice clearly said dispersed. Yet 2 years had passed, and all he had received were promises of callbacks and a few outdated brochures. Vance inhaled and reset his expression. "Sir," he said, "grouping all cases and asking for a single number will always create misunderstanding. We have complaint handling procedures, a hotline, and support teams. If your comrades are having issues, you are welcome to meet with us privately after the session." "My comrades already have," Elias replied, without raising his voice. "They have called, written letters, and submitted additional documents. What they always receive in return is the phrase, 'being processed.' Some have waited 2 years. Meanwhile, their names appear in performance reports under the category funds dispersed." From the back of the room, someone sniffed softly, a sound half laugh and half irritation. A representative from a non-profit organization adjusted their posture, placed a pen on their knee, but wrote nothing further. The atmosphere in the room visibly sagged. The colorful charts on the screen suddenly felt disconnected from the real faces, sitting beneath the white lights. The moderator glanced around, clearly sensing the spreading tension, but did not dare interrupt without a signal from the panel. Vance clenched his jaw, the muscles around his mouth standing out. "Thank you for your very emotional feedback," he said, enunciating each word. "I understand that every case has its own context. However, we are discussing the overall system. Its success cannot be negated simply because of a few negative experiences recounted here." From the seats on the right, a chair creaked softly. A middle-aged veteran half stood and then sat back down, his hands clasped together. He looked at Elias, then at Vance, his gaze growing colder. Elias did not respond immediately. He let a moment of silence pass, then spoke slowly. "If those experiences appear in hundreds of files, then they are no longer emotional anecdotes. They are bad data hidden behind good numbers. Your system uses us as the green portion of the chart, then leaves us to fend for ourselves in the white space." The words landed like a heavy object. No one laughed. No one applauded. Some people avoided looking toward the veterans section, afraid of accidentally meeting eyes that matched stories they had heard and ignored for years. The moderator hurried to the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne," he said, forcing his voice into a neutral tone. "What you have raised is a necessary reminder. The organizing committee will compile these points and forward them to the appropriate authorities. Now, to stay on schedule, we will move on to another question." But the room suddenly seemed reluctant to raise hands. A state delegate rotated a pen between his fingers, considered it, then stopped. A major donor glanced at his watch and chose silence rather than being drawn into a debate he could not control. Finally, a representative from a veteran support organization asked a safe question about strengthening communications for existing programs. Vance seized on it, speaking at length and in broad terms, returning to his familiar vocabulary of vision, innovation, and partnerships. His voice grew warmer, his pace quicker, as if trying to paint a fresh coat over the exchange that had just occurred. Even so, each time his eyes swept across the front rows, Vance saw Elias's white hair, the aged face with its unwavering gaze. This time, he remembered it clearly. The name Elias Hawthorne was faintly underlined in his mind. Separated from the anonymous crowd, it was no longer a random raised hand, but a source of interference that caused his polished numbers to begin looking worse each time they appeared on the screen. The next morning, the conference reconvened in full session. The slogan still glowed brightly on the screen, but the excitement had thinned. Each time the question and answer segment was mentioned, a few people glanced toward the veterans' seating area, where the white-haired old man had twice caused Gregory Vance's speech to stumble. The atmosphere was quieter, more cautious, as if the room remembered what had happened the day before. Vance stepped onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and smiled as if nothing were wrong. He continued talking about digital transformation, online platforms, and golden opportunities for veterans. Applause still came, but it was sparse and short. Some people stared at their phones. Others scanned the program, waiting for the break to arrive. When it came time for voices from the veterans, the moderator appeared. He invited a few people to come up and share success stories, faces that had clearly been selected in advance. One veteran talked about being connected with a business partner. The hall applauded, and Vance nodded as if the point had just been proven beyond doubt. "Is there anyone else?" the moderator asked, sweeping his eyes across the room, "who would like to share their experience with the program?" Elias raised his hand. The motion was slow but firm. A few whispers flared up and quickly died down. "That old man again," someone muttered, then fell silent under the looks of others. "Mr. Hawthorne," Vance immediately said, his smile sharpening. "It is good to see you continuing to participate." Elias stood up and walked down the center aisle toward the microphone. The lights shone straight down, making his silver hair stand out among the sea of dark suits. One or two phones were lifted, ready to record the troublesome old man once again. He gripped the microphone and lifted his other hand to adjust it. The worn jacket sleeve slid up, revealing his left wrist. A faded tattoo became clearly visible, a pale eagle on wrinkled skin, and beneath it, 4 small numbers, 1168. A young delegate nearby noticed first and nudged a friend. "Hey, the old guy has a battlefield tattoo." The other glanced over and laughed. "Classic old soldier." Elias kept his eyes on the stage. "I want to speak about the files that were reported as dispersed," he began. Vance laughed. The sound carried loudly through the speakers. "Oh," he drawled. "Today, we have not only questions, but even a Saigon-era tattoo as well." A few laughs followed. The moderator hesitated. Vance stepped closer to the edge of the stage, leaning on the podium and looking down. "So the old man kept his Saigon tattoo," Vance said cheerfully, with a blade hidden behind his words. "An eagle, right, a symbol of late-night drinking and getting inked in a hurry before heading back out there." The laughter grew louder. A group of young delegates near the sponsor section burst out laughing, some even clapping as if watching a performance. A voice loud enough carried across several rows. "Old already, and still showing off tattoos. Kinda cute." In that laughter, Elias heard a familiar sound from many years ago, when his first reports had been brushed aside with a few jokes, in closed meeting rooms, then buried under new, clean files that smelled only of paper and fresh ink. No one had asked what he had lost. Elias glanced down at his wrist, seeing the tattoo fully exposed. He did not cover it. His hand rested loosely beside the microphone as his gaze returned to the stage. But the entire room had already been pulled into a different story. Vance turned half his body toward the audience. "An eagle," he said with a shrug, "probably dreaming of flying home after a few fun nights in Saigon bars. A romantic past, sure, but we are working with data, with new models, not living in a museum of memories." This time, the laughter spread wider. Some people nodded along just to move on. A few faces tightened, but remained silent. No one said that the joke had crossed the line of respect that the conference kept projecting on its slides. The moderator cut in, hurriedly grasping for an exit. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne, for being willing to share," he said, his voice slightly strained. "Your feedback on the files will be discussed privately with the support team at the consultation desks. To keep on schedule, we will now move on to the next section." Elias looked at him, then back at Vance. He did not fight for the microphone. He turned and walked back along the carpeted aisle, his footsteps small but clearly audible among the nearby rows of chairs. People shifted their feet aside, eyes either glued to the screen or flicking toward him and away again. He sat back down in his old seat and pulled his sleeve over his wrist. His fingers stopped right on the tattoo, pressing lightly as if on a scar. On stage, a new slide appeared, showing bright classrooms and smiling veterans holding certificates. Vance once again spoke of the future, of opportunity, of how people like you will be at the center. The laughter faded, replaced by a strange, heavy layer of silence. A younger veteran in the back row watched Elias's retreating figure and remembered the email saying he had been approved, followed by 2 years of waiting with no call. He raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again, sensing that if he stood up now, he would become the next joke. If at that moment a camera had moved away from Gregory Vance's brightly lit face and panned down to the veterans section, It would have stopped on Elias's left wrist, where the tattoo 1168 lay half hidden beneath his sleeve. The number no one understood, just dragged out as an excuse for laughter, lay still like a thin crack on a polished stone surface. With the right pressure at the right point, it could run long and split open the wall of data this entire conference was leaning on. Do you think this is just an old tattoo, or something that will make the whole system pay the price? Leave your speculation in the comments, and follow and subscribe to the channel to see the moment when 1168 is no longer just a private mark on an old man's skin. In the sessions that followed, the conference continued to run exactly on schedule, following the slides and the script prepared in advance by the organizers. There was only one thing not included in the official materials, yet it became more visible with each passing day, the way the name Elias Hawthorne was gradually being attached to an image that no one needed to say out loud. People no longer called him by name, but by whispered phrases in hallways, by the coffee machine, in restrooms, the tattooed old man, the old guy who got teased yesterday, the old man who likes asking about unemployment. That afternoon, in a medium-sized meeting room with U-shaped rows of chairs, people were discussing optimizing the disbursement process for training funds. That was what the sign at the front of the room said. In reality, most of what was said revolved around praising interdepartmental cooperation and citing a few carefully selected success stories. Gregory Vance sat again at the center of the head table, his suit neat, his face showing a hint of fatigue, yet his voice remained tightly controlled. "We have significantly shortened application processing times," Vance said, his eyes moving across the faces in front of him. "Just look at these figures, and you will clearly see the collective effort of the entire system." The moderator once again invited questions. Arms rose hesitantly, partly out of shyness, partly out of the fear that asking would lead nowhere anyway. After a moment, Elias raised his hand. No one was surprised anymore. The gesture had become part of the program itself. A few people sighed very softly. Others tilted their heads, waiting to see what the old man would say this time. Before the moderator could speak, Vance leaned forward, lifting his hand toward Elias with an expression that was both humorous and wary. Yes, he said, a laugh already waiting at the end of the sentence. "Does the old man with the tattoos have another historical question for us?" As soon as the words landed, a few weak laughs rippled through the room. No one dared to laugh loudly like the day before, but it was enough to create the feeling that they were sharing a private joke. A young delegate seated near the door leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, "He's turning the old man into a recurring act." The other nodded slightly. "If this keeps up, he'll become the symbol of the troublemakers." Elias stood up anyway, his gaze fixed directly on the head table. He waited for the thin laughter to fade before speaking. "The budget has been dispersed. So why are the files still on hold?" The short question fell squarely into the center of the session's topic. Like a heavy stone, the room fell silent. The note-taker stopped writing and looked up. A young veteran sitting against the wall bit his lip, eyes lowered, his hand on his knee tightening into a fist. Vance took the microphone and swept his eyes around, as if checking whether anyone else wanted to ask something. No hands rose. He tapped his fingernail lightly against the body of the microphone, then smiled, though the smile was now noticeably faded. "The process is complex. You don't need to worry," Vance said, his voice firmer. "When funds are dispersed from the federal level downward, they must pass through multiple layers of confirmation, auditing, and reconciliation. That time is necessary to protect you yourselves, the beneficiaries." Elias did not change his expression. "I understand the process," he said evenly. "I am asking why there are files reported as having been fully dispersed since last year, yet the people named in those files have still not received any support. A delay of a few weeks might be considered normal. A delay of more than a year, what do you call that?" Another stretch of silence followed. A few pens tapped rhythms on tabletops. A woman in the left row twirled her pen in her fingers, glancing nervously toward Vance, as if waiting for him to produce a prepared answer. Vance grew slightly impatient. "Sir, as I have already said," he emphasized, "there will always be exceptional cases. Perhaps those files lacked documentation. Perhaps the local offices handled them poorly. The process here is not always perfect, but it works. We cannot judge the entire system as problematic because of a few special cases." "A few special cases," Elias repeated, his eyes never leaving Vance. "At the back of this room, I saw at least 3 people who sought me out during this morning's break to tell me they are also among the files that have been put on hold. I do not think your system is dealing with just a few cases. I think we are looking at a number that is far from small. The young veteran by the wall lowered his head even further. His fingers dug into the edge of his chair, his knuckles turning white. He knew Elias was talking about him, and about many others like him scattered throughout the hall. He did not dare look up, afraid of meeting someone's eyes and having his face remembered as that of a troublemaker. Vance brushed the matter aside, his voice turning cold and dry. I suggest that we do not turn this discussion into a venue for handling individual complaints, he said. The organizers have set up dedicated consultation desks outside in the hallway. You and others are welcome to go there. Our staff will review each specific file. Here, we are discussing macro-level policy and direction. I ask that you respect that distinction. A few reluctant nods appeared, unclear whether they signaled agreement or merely the appearance of paying attention. The moderator clung to the statement like a lifebuoy. Yes, thank you, Mr. Hawthorne, he said, carefully adjusting his tone. Your question will be forwarded to the technical team. Now, to ensure time for other delegates, we will move on to the next question. Elias did not argue further. He dipped his chin slightly and sat down, pulling a notebook from the seat pocket. The pen was uncapped again, his slanted handwriting adding new lines beneath the old notes. From time to time, he paused, looked up at Vance, speaking about optimization and transparency, then lowered his gaze again. A young veteran seated behind him leaned slightly toward his neighbor and whispered, his voice so low that only the intended listener could hear it. He just said exactly what I've been thinking. The neighbor glanced toward the head table, then looked away. Don't get involved, he replied. They don't like people who ask questions that mess up the slides. In the sessions that followed, the pattern repeated with only thin variations. Elias raised his hand. Vance saw him and cut in first, tossing out a few joking remarks about wartime tattoos, historical stories, or personalized issues. People laughed less, but they did not object. Another time, during a session on connecting businesses with veterans, Elias had barely stood up when Vance's voice rang down from the stage. Mr. Hawthorne, I hope today your question will relate to new cooperation models, rather than matters from half a century ago. A few scattered laughs broke out. Elias remained standing, one hand gripping the back of the chair in front of him to steady himself. I am asking about now, he said firmly. Last year, the budget was fully dispersed for a joint program between your organization and Company X. Many veterans were notified that they had been accepted into the training program. To this day, that course has not begun. The company says it has not received sufficient funding, while the program says the transfer was completed. So, where is the money sitting? The crowd began to murmur more loudly. Someone frowned and flipped back through the documents in their hands, searching for any line that mentioned that program. A representative from the business group seated near the front turned to a colleague and lowered his voice. There it is again. This time, he's naming a company directly. Gregory Vance took a deep breath, his eyes suddenly darkening. I will repeat myself, he said, stressing each word. The process is complex. You do not need to worry. If the issues you raise are real, the organizers will investigate them. This is not the place for you to draw conclusions or challenge contracts to which you are not authorized full access. In the corner of the room, someone whispered very softly, the words slipping out like a sigh. This old man, he's not simple. The person beside him replied, eyes still fixed on Elias. I don't think he came here just to ask questions for fun. From the back of the room, several other pairs of eyes began to change the way they looked at him. Instead of seeing Elias as a source of humor, they started to wonder where he found such specific stories, program names, and contradictions, things they usually only heard about over coffee after work. As for Vance, each time his gaze swept over the rows of veterans, it was no longer merely the look of someone fully in control. Within it flickered a trace of irritation, a thin sign that he had begun to see Elias not as a random nuisance, but as a target that required closer attention. The meeting hours dragged on, discussion sessions following one another, like pre-programmed segments. New charts, new slogans, new exemplary cases were displayed, one after another. But the people seated in the hall began to feel weary, not only because of the hard chairs or the cold air conditioning, but because of the sense that something unseen was being stretched tight in the air, something no one wanted to name. Each time Elias raised his hand, a few heads subtly turned away. Some people sighed, others leaned in, torn between avoiding trouble and an irresistible curiosity. Gregory Vance sensed this more clearly than anyone else. In the next plenary session, his voice was quicker than on the first day, his transitions abrupt, as if trying to outrun any doubts. "We have achieved significant progress," Vance said, his eyes fixed more on the projected screen behind him than on the rows of seats below. "The on-time disbursement rate has increased, the number of newly approved training programs has increased, and veteran satisfaction has also increased." The moderator once again mentioned the question and answer portion. The phrase, "Does anyone have a question?" echoed and hovered over the sound system. A few people spun the pens in their hands, then stopped. A quiet gap stretched on for a few seconds, long enough for everyone to know that the same image had appeared in all their minds. Then, as if inevitably, Elias's hand slowly rose. This time, without waiting for the moderator to call on him, Vance spoke first. "Yes, I see, Mr. Hawthorne," he said, trying to lace humor into his voice. "It is the third day now, and it seems you have been very enthusiastic in contributing." Elias stood up. He did not joke back, nor did he respond to that extra remark. He looked straight toward the presiding table. "There is still one issue that has not been addressed," he said. "The backlog of cases." A few people in the middle rows shifted slightly, as if to hear more clearly. Vance inhaled, his fingers brushing lightly along the microphone. "The gentleman and the backlog again," he repeated, his tone now less friendly. "Very well. Please proceed. I hope this time the question will not be a repetition." "It will not be a repetition," Elias said. "This time, I want to ask about the cases your organization has marked as fully dispersed, but the individuals named in them say they have still received nothing." At every session, he glanced down at the folded sheet of paper in his hand. "I encounter one more person like that." The murmuring grew louder. Someone whispered, "Here we go again." Another replied, "Let's see how Vance spins it this time." Gregory Vance held the microphone close to his mouth. "I think we have talked far too much about this matter already." He snapped slightly, the veneer of courtesy cracking. "We are not here to listen to personal stories." The words dropped onto the hall like a curtain yanked down hard. Some delegates turned to look at one another, expressions mixed with surprise and irritation. A few younger veterans pressed their lips together. From the back rows came the creak of a chair as someone shifted position, holding back a reaction. Elias did not retreat. He did not raise his voice, nor did he soften it to placate. He spoke in the same low tone he had used for 3 days, but the words were sharper. "But these are real people," Elias said. "They have names in your reports. They are used in your slides to polish your disbursement rates. So when they do not receive support, is that a personal matter or a systemic one?" The entire hall fell silent. A speaker seated next to Vance shifted his chair slightly, avoiding the gaze now beginning to turn toward the presiding table. A woman in the front row gripped her notebook tightly, her fingers pressing their joints into the leather cover. In the distance, the camera of an independent journalist blinked a small red light, signaling that the lens was recording. The heavy air crept between the rows of seats. Some people avoided looking at Elias, as if meeting his eyes would be enough to implicate them in the issue. Others stared intently at Vance, waiting to see what he would do next. The mockery, the jokes, the casual remarks about tattoos and romantic pasts suddenly felt out of place. Vance pressed his lips together. Then, remembering the dozens of eyes upon him, took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and pulled his mouth into a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, trying to return his voice to a presentation cadence, "any system will have cases of error. What matters is that we have procedures to address them. We commit to reviewing all the cases Mr. Hawthorne has mentioned, provided he supplies complete information. But I must emphasize once again, this is a conference to build a vision for the future, not an on-the-spot tribunal. I hope you understand." A scattered round of applause followed, uneven, indecisive. Some clapped out of habit, because it seemed expected. Others clapped simply to end it, to escape the tension. The applause sounded thin and brief, dissolving in the hall before it could become a shared rhythm. Elias nodded, added nothing more, and sat down. He opened his notebook and wrote a few short lines. From close up, one could see the new words squeezed beneath old bullet points, linking together the phrases backlog, dispersed, and not received. In the row behind him, a young veteran bowed his head, clenching his hand so tightly that his fingernails dug into his palm. His gaze fixed downward until the burning sensation in his skin pulled him back to the present. Vance continued his speech, now, speaking faster and faster. Transitions came abruptly, and phrases like, "as you can see," and "we must look at the big picture," were repeated often. He scarcely looked down anymore, focusing instead on the slides behind him, the monitor on the podium. Anywhere except the row where he knew an old, steady gaze was fixed upon him. After a while, the moderator asked to interrupt Vance for a few minutes to read an announcement from the organizing committee. His voice rang out, striving to regain enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude the afternoon session, the organizing committee would like to announce a special program for tomorrow's closing session. As you know, the final session this year will be attended by the honorary chair. A slight ripple of noise passed through the hall. Someone murmured, the one they have been mentioning since the start of the conference. Another asked, is that the female general or something? I forgot her name. The moderator pressed a button on the remote. The large screen behind the presiding table switched to a new slide, a dark blue background, with white text appearing large and clear. In the center was the line, Honorary Chair General Margaret Hale retired. Beside it was a photograph of an older woman in ceremonial uniform, rows of medals on her chest gleaming under the studio lights. A few soft whistles sounded from the far side. Impressive. They managed to bring Margaret back here. Someone murmured. She used to be a nightmare for those logistics guys. The person next to him laughed. I heard she handled warehouses faster than today's accountants. In the veterans section, someone lifted his head sharply upon reading the name. A gray-haired veteran smacked his lips. If Margaret shows up, those showboaters here will have to choose their words more carefully. Elias was bent over his notebook, his pen stopping mid-word. He slowly raised his head and looked up at the screen. In his aged eyes, something closed quietly behind him, while something else opened ahead. No one was close enough to hear the faint breath he let out, but a few people nearby noticed that his posture straightened slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the notebook tightening, as if a decision had just been sealed in silence. The moderator continued enthusiastically about the closing ceremony, about the inspirational speech by General Margaret, about strategic vision in supporting veterans. To many, those words passed by like another advertisement, but in the third row, where Elias had sat since the first day, his gaze had changed. He stared at the name Margaret on the screen, as if looking at a door long left open, one he had been standing outside of, waiting for the right moment to step through. On the final day of the conference, the Grand Hyatt Hall was brightly lit, yet the atmosphere felt heavy. 3 days of presentations, so-called record-breaking charts, and bursts of laughter at the questions of an old man had exhausted many people. Quite a few attended the closing session merely to get it over with, while others were curious to hear what the retired General Margaret Hale would say. The front rows were filled with officials, sponsors, and state representatives. The section for veterans was even more crowded, with murmurs spreading about the tattooed old man who had made earlier sessions uncomfortable. On the stage, the center chair was reserved for Margaret, who had once commanded major logistics units and was now a symbol of the promise to never abandon veterans. Margaret stepped out in a perfectly pressed dress uniform. The entire hall rose in applause. She spoke briefly, emphasizing that those who had once worn the uniform had long since paid their debt, while those now running the programs must repay theirs with results, not slogans. Gregory Vance sat 2 seats away from her, nodding as if in agreement, occasionally jotting notes on the printed copy of his own speech. In the third row, Elias Hawthorne sat upright, eyes fixed on the stage. The name Margaret stirred a distant memory within him, but he remained still, waiting to see where the ceremony would lead. The coordinator moved to the center of the stage, his voice upbeat. He announced a tribute ritual, inviting several elderly veterans to come forward, so that the general and the entire hall could offer their greetings. Names were read one by one, each elderly person rising. Then the loudspeaker sounded, "Veteran Elias Hawthorne, please come forward." Elias grasped the back of his chair and stood up. Whispers immediately spread around him. "It's him, the old man who keeps asking about records," someone else muttered. "Let's see if he gets mocked again today." Elias turned toward the aisle and walked slowly but firmly toward the steps. The stage lights felt hotter as he reached the final step. The coordinator guided him into position at the center of the line of veterans. The others stood straight, facing the audience. Opposite them, Margaret sat in the seat of honor, her gaze studying each face. Elias lifted a hand to adjust his jacket. The cuff of his shirt slid up, revealing his left wrist. A faded eagle tattoo appeared clearly, its wings still spread wide. Just beneath it was a small sequence of numbers, 11, 6, 8. Under the lights, the tattoo that seemed faded suddenly stood out. A few younger delegates in the front rows noticed and nudged each other, whispering, "That's it, the Saigon tattoo." Margaret's eyes moved along the line of veterans, nodding to several of them. When she reached Elias, she was about to nod in greeting, then stopped. She looked down at his wrist, narrowed her eyes, and leaned slightly forward. The Fated Eagle and the sequence 1168, connected to a memory buried under stacks of reports, a logistics unit on the brink of collapse, and the name Hawthorne, signed at the bottom of the page. Those in the front rows thought the general was merely moved by meeting an acquaintance, but those closer to the stage noticed her shoulders suddenly tense. Margaret pressed her hands against the arm of her chair and stood upright. The chair slid slightly backward, the dry scrape echoing through the hall as it fell silent. She turned, facing the line of veterans, facing Elias directly. A thin moment of silence settled over the rows of seats. Then she raised her right arm in a sharp military salute, hand level with her temple, directed toward the old man bearing the 1168 tattoo. The whispers stopped instantly. The veterans seated below straightened their backs. A few people drew deep breaths, eyes fixed on that raised arm. No one had been warned, yet their bodies recognized the ritual. For a brief moment, the hall was brightly lit, yet as quiet as a drill field, awaiting orders. Margaret's voice rang out. At first, not yet through the microphone but still commanding. The coordinator handed her the microphone, which she took while maintaining the salute. "Major General Elias Hawthorne," she said, each word falling clearly. Many people thought they had misheard. A sponsor turned to a colleague, mouth opening and then closing again. In the veterans section, someone softly repeated, "Major General," as if checking their own hearing. The face of the old man, once mocked, deed now carried a rank few had ever imagined. Margaret lowered her salute and held the microphone with both hands. She did not look at the audience. She looked at Elias, "The man who saved my unit from a logistics disaster," she said, "the man who laid the first bricks for the veteran employment support system we are gathered here to discuss. I salute you." No one applauded. Her words landed heavily, dragging with them every time Vance had laughed at the Saigon-era tattoo, dismissed the questions as history, and labeled outrage as emotional. Those remarks now sounded more like confessions than defenses. Elias looked at Margaret. For 3 days, he had remained silent about his rank, letting questions be weighed by truth rather than hierarchy. Now the past was pulled into the spotlight. He inclined his head slightly and gave a brief nod, as if reclaiming a debt of honor long neglected. On the dais, Gregory Vance sat rigid. He watched the scene on stage and felt his throat go dry. The man he had turned into a joke over an old tattoo turned out to be a major general, someone whom a figure like Margaret would stand at attention to salute before an entire conference. The very person who had laid the foundation for the system Vance was boasting about. Vance could find no words. In his mind, every remark he had made over the 3 days replayed, from the old man and the tattoo to personal matters. Below, several gazes had shifted, no longer looking at him with the same trust as before. They were quiet, but sharp, filled with doubt. On the stage, Elias remained standing where the organizers had placed him. The 1168 tattoo still peeked out beneath his sleeve. It was no longer a detail for jokes, but a sign that this so-called model system carried a debt that had never been repaid. Margaret's words still seemed to hang over everyone. "The man who laid the foundation for this very system. I salute you." Vance stood frozen. Elias gave a slight nod. "If you were Gregory Vance, what would you do when the past rises to salute you in front of hundreds of people? Watching and commenting to Sohoth truth will crush. Do you think such a public salute is enough? Or is it merely the opening shot of an investigation? Write your speculation, share your personal feelings, and prepare to move on to the next part of this story." After Margaret's salute, the hall remained frozen, as if time itself had stopped. The usual sounds of chairs scraping the floor, quiet coughing, and rustling paper vanished completely. Only the steady hum of the air conditioning drifted down from the ceiling, strangely loud in the silence. Everyone had just witnessed a 4-star general snap to attention and salute an old man whom, for the past 3 days, they had mocked as the tattooed old guy. At last, the moderator managed to recover his voice. "May I ask everyone to take their seats?" he said, the scripted words suddenly sounding dry and brittle. He turned toward Vance, waiting for a signal. If the program's lead did not speak now, the entire closing session risked slipping out of control. Gregory Vance understood that everything was hanging over his head. He lifted the microphone, pressed his lips together for a brief moment, then forced out his familiar tone. "We will continue with the program," Vance said with an awkward smile. "Thank you to the General and to our veterans for reminding us of the true purpose of this conference. No one laughed at that line. A few scattered claps echoed weakly, and then faded, completely lacking their usual uniform rhythm. Most of the hall stayed silent, eyes fixed on the stage, while their minds replayed Vance's earlier jabs about the Saigon-era tattoo and his dismissal of Elias's questions as emotional and history. Those words now tasted far more bitter in memory than when they were first spoken. The moderator hurriedly stepped in, announcing that the ceremonial portion had concluded and inviting the veterans to return to their seats. Backstage staff guided them down one by one. When it came to Elias, the young staffer hesitated for half a second, then quietly said, "This way, Major General." The form of address sounded strange even to himself, yet no one objected. Elias descended the steps without looking around or acknowledging anyone. He was led to an empty seat in the front row, right beside the aisle. When he sat down, the atmosphere along the entire row visibly shifted. Some people unconsciously straightened their backs, others looked away, while a few stared directly at him, as if trying to confirm that this really was the man Margaret had just addressed as Major General Elias Hawthorne. A delegate in the second row leaned toward a colleague. "A real Major General," he whispered. The person beside him scrolled quickly on a phone screen, where the name Elias Hawthorne appeared in an old article. "It says he commanded logistics during the Vietnam era," the colleague replied softly, "and helped lay the groundwork for several veteran support programs. If it is the same man, then we have been mocking him for 3 straight days." On the stage, Vance turned his back toward the audience more often, fixing his gaze on the projected screen behind him. He signaled for the next slide. A new chart appeared, its title referring to veteran satisfaction rates. Vance clung to it like a lifeline. "As you can see," he said, "more than 70% of veterans participating in the program report positive evaluations. This is the clearest proof of the effectiveness of what we are doing." Few people paid attention. The numbers drifted past their eyes, but their thoughts remained stuck on the image of the 11-68 tattoo under the lights and Margaret's raised arm in salute. In several rows, people exchanged looks, wondering how the organizers could have allowed a Major General to sit unnoticed in the open veteran seating area and endure ridicule throughout the entire conference. Margaret sat in the seat of honor, her posture still straight. She did not interrupt Vance's presentation, but each time words like satisfaction, optimization, or procedural compliance were spoken, her brows drew together almost imperceptibly. She glanced down toward the front row where Elias sat, then looked back across the hall, as if reminding herself that every number had to answer to a real person. In the sponsor section, a middle-aged man let out a quiet groan. "Damn it, I laughed in that old man's face for 3 days straight," he said to his companion, "and only now do I learn he is a Major General." The other replied in a flat voice, "Not just a Major General, but one of the people who built this system." Vance turned him into a living witness to everything wrong. Gregory Vance felt every silent gaze clinging to him. He flipped a page of his notes, but his hand trembled slightly, forcing him to grip the paper's edge. His voice remained steady, still using familiar phrases, yet a new fear had taken shape in his mind why Elias had come here, and how far the old man might go after leaving this hall. When the presentation ended, the moderator announced the final remarks from Margaret. She took the microphone, stood, and faced the audience. "I have attended many conferences," she said, "but few have reminded me as clearly as this one that every statistic about veterans is tied to a real face. If we use their names in reports while leaving them waiting outside for years, then no matter how beautiful the charts are, they are still just paper." Another layer of silence settled over the room. Vance swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He knew those words were not meant only for the audience, but were a direct reminder aimed at the head table. He adjusted his tie, feeling as though it were slowly tightening around his neck. In the front row, Elias remained motionless, eyes lifted toward the stage. When Margaret returned the microphone to the moderator, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze moving slowly from her to Vance. That look no longer belonged to an old man, asking random questions. It was calm, sharp, and deep, the gaze of someone accustomed to seeing cracks form from the inside of walls. Vance looked away, yet he could still feel himself being watched. The closing applause rose, evenly spread but lacking any real warmth. People stood a little slower than usual, as if still thinking about what they had just missed. Amid the crowd quietly gathering their documents, someone whispered to a friend, voice very low, "This old man, he is not the type who causes trouble for fun." The other replied, eyes still following Elias's figure in the front row, "I think so too. He looks like someone sitting and waiting for a crack to split open on its own." Elias's gaze passed over Vance once more, then returned to the empty stage, as if he were counting down each fracture within the very system that Vance believed belonged to him. After the main session, the hall began to empty. People gathered in small clusters in the hallway, coffee cups in hand, whispering about the moment Margaret stood at attention to salute Elias, and about the drained look on Gregory Vance's face. The laughter was no longer carefree, only a few awkward sounds, as if someone had just realized they had been applauding at the wrong moments for several days straight. At the end of the hallway was a small waiting room. The door stood slightly ajar. Inside were a few leather chairs, a jug of filtered water, and several old photographs hanging on the wall. There was no screen, no podium, just a quiet place to escape the lights and the microphones. Elias walked in. He set his briefcase on the chair beside him, poured a glass of water, then sat and turned his chair toward a small window overlooking the street. From there, he could see figures moving back and forth in the hallway, and hear fragments of conversation carried in by the air. That old man really is a major general. She would not salute just anyone. How have we been treating him these past 3 days? The words drifted by. Elias laced his fingers together and rested them on his knees, glanced down at his left wrist, hidden beneath his sleeve, then looked back toward the door. He was in no hurry to leave the conference. He wanted to see what would reveal itself once the crowd believed everything was over. The waiting room door opened again. A young man stepped in and paused, uncertain whether to go further. When he saw Elias, he closed the door, stood for another second, then approached. "Sir," Lucas Ramirez spoke, his voice low, as if he had just crossed an invisible line. Elias tilted his head, recognizing the young veteran with black hair and sun-darkened skin, who had been sitting in the back rows throughout the conference. He gestured with a wave of his hand. "Sit down, son." Lucas pulled a chair across from him and sat on its edge, his hands clasped together. For a moment, the room held only the soft hum of the air conditioner. There was no audience, no camera. The silence here was real silence. Lucas's gaze slipped to Elias's left wrist. The image of the eagle tattoo and the sequence 1168 from the stage rose clearly in his mind. 1168, he said, half repeating it, half testing whether he remembered correctly. "My father once talked about a report with that code. He was a Vietnam veteran. He said it disappeared, and no one dared mention it anymore." Elias remained silent for a beat, then rolled up his sleeve. The ink had faded, the skin wrinkled with age, but the eagle was still visible, and the 4 digits were as sharp as carved marks. He placed his wrist on the table between them. "Not a war memorial," Elias said. Lucas held his breath. He had guessed as much, but hearing the confirmation still tightened his chest. "Then what is it, sir?" he asked. "A report code," Elias replied. "A report I submitted in November of 1968, about funds meant for veterans being diverted away from those who needed them. They could make the file disappear, so I carved its name into my own skin." Lucas stared at the numbers. "My father said someone wrote an accusation, naming fake contracts outright," he whispered. "After that, everything went quiet. People called it fiction, rumor, the bitterness of old men. In a system that favors attractive images," Elias said, "the first thing erased is whatever ruins the picture." Lucas leaned back deeper into his chair. "I think about myself," he said. "I filed my application 2 years ago and was told it was approved, that the fund had been dispersed. They said a training course would come in 3 months. 3 months became 6, then 12. Now it is 24. Every time I call, they say the process is slow, and the file is being handled." Elias nodded slightly. "You thought you had encountered a glitch," he said, "but the number of people who have told me that same story has long exceeded what a technical error could explain." "You mean what is happening to my generation?" Lucas asked. "Is a copy of what you tried to expose in the 1168 report. History does not repeat every detail," Elias replied. "But those who learn that burying a report is the safest path to promotion rarely break the habit. Back then, DON'T was post-war funds. Now, it is job training funds. Different names, different years, but the number of people left behind is the same." Lucas pressed his lips together. He remembered Vance's slides, the record-breaking disbursement figures that drew applause, then remembered that his rent was still paid with wages from loading docks. "I used to believe in what they called the system," he said, "because without that belief, there was nothing else to hold on to. Now all I have left are appointment slips and apologies, identical down to every word." Elias looked at him, his eyes deep but clear. "You are not the first to say that to me," he said. "Back then, too, there were people who believed one more time, then one more time again, until they no longer had the strength to believe." Lucas fell silent. His eyes returned to the tattoo. "So you keep that code on your arm?" he asked. For what purpose beyond remembering? To remind myself that there was a time I believed submitting one report was enough. Elias answered, and that this belief was exploited by those who knew how to trade silence for position. The small room grew quiet again. The murmurs in the hallway seemed to retreat. The tattoo on Elias's wrist lay between them like the only document no one had ever confiscated. Elias looked down at it, then raised his eyes, lowering his voice. The report was buried, he said, by a young aide. Lucas listened, his heart pounding, knowing he had truly stepped into the storm. The waiting room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioner was clearly audible. Elias leaned back in his chair, the tattooed wrist resting on the edge of the table, his leather briefcase propped against his leg. Across from him, Lucas sat slightly hunched forward, his eyes fixed on the 4 dark numbers, 1168, etched into the wrinkled skin. Which November, sir? He broke the silence, his voice low but tightly held. November of 1968. Elias replied immediately, as if reciting a line carved into his mind. When the ministry began allocating funds for the post-war phase, I was assigned to review the flow of money moving through the logistics units. Lucas swallowed hard. His father had once spoken of a November report, then stopped, saying only that it had been buried somewhere among stacks of paper. So 1168 is the code for that report, he asked. What did you write that made you put it on your own skin? I submitted the first report on post-war fund embezzlement, Elias said slowly. The funds were recorded as meant for vocational training, job creation, and support for veterans after discharge. But when I compared the figures on paper with the actual classes, the real people, and the real contracts, a large portion of the money led to no one at all. He turned his wrist slightly so the numbers faced Lucas fully. Millions of dollars were routed through shell companies. Elias continued, names that sounded very humane, but with no offices, no instructors, no addresses beyond a few mailboxes. All that existed was a neat stack of payment documents. Lucas felt his chest tighten. He remembered the 2 years of waiting. The emails saying the budget had been dispersed. The phone calls passed endlessly between contacts. And you gathered all of that into the report coded 1168, he asked. You submitted it through the proper channels. I listed every amount, every contract, with reconciliation tables attached. Elias nodded. I recommended freezing the funds until verification was complete, because otherwise the fraudsters would have more time to erase their tracks. His mouth twisted into a smile with no warmth. The next day, I asked the record secretary whether code 1168 had been signed in. He checked the ledger and said he could not find it. I assumed it was a clerical error and went to accounting, where they said perhaps the file was on someone's desk. When I asked my superior, I received an irritated look and the remark that I was being overly sensitive. Lucas clenched his hands on his knees, and then it vanished, he asked. No original copy, no receipt, no trace in the logs. In the system, it never existed, Elias said, but I knew I had written it, signed it, submitted it, and heard the stamp hit the page. When paperwork can disappear that easily, I decided to leave it somewhere harder to erase. He raised his wrist to Lucas's eye level. I carved 1168 onto my arm to remind myself that the report was real. If everything remained only as words, after enough years, even I might begin to doubt my own memory. Lucas studied the numbers and saw no pride in them at all. So this is not a war trophy tattoo, he whispered. No, Elias answered. It is the mark of a warning buried alive, and of a system that chose to protect its image rather than people. Lucas leaned back and took a deep breath. My father said someone rang the bell, he recalled, but the bell was held underwater, so people pretended they heard nothing. I suppose he was talking about you. I do not care who remembers me, Elias said. I care about what happened to the money and to the people who were supposed to receive it. He paused, then asked the most important question. Who handled the file, Lucas said. Who had the authority to pass the report upward, or throw it out of the system? Every file has the name of the last person who touched it, Elias replied. Code 1168 was recorded as having passed across the desk of a young assistant in the post-war fund management division. That day, his name was at the end of the line. Did you meet him in person? Lucas asked. I met him in the hallway, Elias nodded. I asked whether the report had reached senior leadership. He said it was being processed according to procedure and told me not to worry. A few days later, the report vanished from all records, and that department was praised for having cleared a large backlog of files. Lucas leaned back, his eyes staring into the space between them. In his mind, Gregory Vance's face at the podium, the smile as he mocked the old man, and his Saigon-era tattoo, the dismissive tone toward questions about stalled files, layered over the image of a young clerk holding a stack of folders. "You still have not said the name," Lucas said quietly. "You have heard it for 3 days," Elias replied. The words caught in Lucas's throat. "Gregory Vance?" he asked, almost wanting to deny his own instinct. "Gregory Vance," Elias confirmed. "Once, a name no one noticed on a list of assistants. Now, the public face of the Veteran Support Program." The man was invited to stand before the screen and display every budget line. A heavy silence settled between them. Lucas rotated his wrist, trying to push away the nausea rising inside him. "You are certain it is the same person?" he insisted. "Not a shared name. Not 2 different people. I hoped it was a coincidence," Elias said. Then I heard him answer questions about stalled files using the same phrases as back then complex procedures, exceptional cases. "You cannot judge a system from a few examples." The same vocabulary used to cover reality. Lucas looked down at his own hands, the calloused skin from hard labor suddenly aching. "So the man who runs the program that brought me here," he said slowly, "the man who talks about responsibility and transparency, was the first to learn that burying a report makes a career cleaner. You have drawn that conclusion yourself," Elias said. "I only added a code number to the story you already lived." Lucas lifted his head. His eyes changed since he had walked in. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "So I take it outside and get labeled a liar? Or so I stay silent and let it rot for another lifetime? I do not need you to answer for me," Elias said. "I stayed silent too long. I want to see what someone abandoned by this very program will choose to do with the truth you just heard." Lucas took a deep breath, held it, then released it slowly. "If what you say is true," he said, "then every apology he offered for unfortunate delays was a performance, and every additional appointment slip was just another layer of dirt piled over reports like 1168. Elias looked at the young veteran for a long moment, then lowered his voice, the words short and cold. He rose. Elias said, through silence, "If you discovered that the head of a support program was the very person who once buried the truth, would you remain silent or stand up? Leave your choice in the comments, and ask yourself how much longer you could endure living inside a system like that." The waiting room was separated from the noise of the main hall by a soundproof door. Inside the small room, there were only 2 people left, with a low wooden table between them. After hearing Gregory Vance's name linked to report 1168, Lucas remained still, his hands clasped together. "So," he said quietly, "the man who laughed at your tattoo, the man who told me to wait longer, is the same person who learned from the beginning how to bury that report. More precisely, he is someone who learned very early on the benefits of silence." Elias replied. He touched his wrist, where the line of faded numbers lay. "And you," he added, "are the one bearing the consequences of that habit. At least here." Lucas exhaled. "What we say doesn't get cut off. That is exactly why I chose this place." Elias nodded. He pulled his leather briefcase closer and unlocked it. In the main hall, words can be recorded incompletely. But this, he lifted several stacks of paper, cannot. He placed the files on the table. The thick covers still clearly showed the federal program logo. "Vocational training contract for veterans," Lucas murmured as he read the first line, then glanced at another stack. "List of pending case files." Elias removed the rubber band and opened the contract. Inside were budget allocation tables, lines labeled total funding, dispersed, and implementing partners. He turned the documents toward Lucas. "These contracts were signed for programs like the one you were promised," Elias said. "The money moves from the Treasury through the implementing units, and on paper, responsibility ends there. Each package is worth several million," Lucas said, "yet I have to fight for every dollar of rent money." He flipped through a few pages and saw photos of opening ceremonies, groups standing in front of program banners. Looking at these pictures, anyone would think everything turned out fine. Elias opened the second folder. "And this," he said, placing it down, "is the list of people used to prove that everything turned out fine." A long list of names followed, with years of birth, units, and submission dates. In the final column were 3 bold words, dispersed. Lucas read quickly, then more slowly. He stopped and pointed at the last column. "All of them have been dispersed?" Lucas asked. "In the system, they are all people who have received support. On paper, yes," Elias said. "But when I tracked down a few people on that list, the answers were the same. No classes, no training, no jobs, Only thank you letters and promises to recheck their files. Lucas turned a few more pages. A familiar name appeared in the middle. This man used to drink with my father, he whispered. Last year, he died in the hospital. Bessades the name. The line still read dispersed. One fewer person. One less problem, Elias said, but in the summary report, one more successful case. How long have you kept these? Lucas asked. Long enough to know I cannot carry all of them everywhere, Elias replied. Some I obtained when I was still in the system. Others were sent to me by people who no longer trust the complaint offices. They sent them to someone they believed would not throw them into the trash. And you want me to hold them? Lucas looked at the stack of papers. An unemployed, unknown veteran, because you are exactly who this program claims to serve, Elias replied. You live in the present world of digital records and online portals. When you say your file is on hold, people will see that it cannot be dismissed as an old story. If I stand up empty-handed, Lucas said, they will say I am being emotional. If I hold all of this, they will say I stole documents. They will say that no matter what you do, Elias said. The difference is that this time, you can place something in the middle of the table that they must glance at before they dare to deny it. He pulled several contracts and a few list pages from the pile, arranging them into a thin stack. He slid them into a clear plastic folder and pushed it toward Lucas. This is enough to begin, he said. You do not need to tell your whole life story. You only need to ask why the people listed as helped on paper are still being abandoned in real life. Where do you plan to use these? Lucas asked. In the closed session, Elias said. They will think it is just a procedural meeting. A few gentle questions, a few vague promises. You can break that script with one well-timed question. Lucas replayed the invitation in his mind. Strategic dialogue with veteran representatives. He gave a dry laugh. It sounds like being asked for input. In reality, it is about being told what to think. So we will use it literally, Elias said. You ask about yourself, about the names on these pages. I will stand up when you need someone to confirm that this began much earlier than they want to admit. And if they cut the microphone, Lucas asked, you have already been cut off from opportunity, Elias replied. Losing a few more minutes of voice is less frightening than watching this list grow longer every year. Lucas fell silent for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said. I will ask. Even if I am erased from every list afterward, at least I will know I did not sign my name to silence. Elias smiled faintly. He stood, gathered the remaining files back into his briefcase, and zipped it shut. 2 generations, one goal. At that moment, the door handle turned, the door opened, and an organizer leaned in. Excuse me, he said. The closed session for the veteran group is about to begin. If you are attending, please proceed to the meeting room on the lower floor. Lucas stood, gripping the folder tightly. Elias picked up his briefcase and walked with him into the hallway. Together, they headed toward the stairs leading down to the sealed meeting room door, carrying with them a number that had never been meant for display. The meeting room on the lower floor was smaller than the main hall, but thick with pressure. The door was shut tight, a few rows of seats reserved for veteran representatives, 1 row for corporate delegates, and the presiding table at the front, where Gregory Vance sat squarely in the center. The nameplate reading Director of the Federal Veterans Employment Program was placed directly in front of him, a reminder that this was his territory. On paper, this session was called a strategic dialogue, but one look at the seating arrangement made it clear who held the power to cut others off. Vance opened with a summary, revisiting the favorable figures and repeating familiar slogans. His voice was low, even, more confident than it had been on the main stage, because there were no cameras here, no press. He believed that inside this room, every question could be managed. This session is for you, Vance concluded, offering a thin smile. Please share your difficulties and proposals. We are here to listen. Several veteran representatives looked down at the blank sheets of paper on their laps. They had heard such invitations too many times, so often that no one believed they still meant anything. 1 or 2 hands twitched, then withdrew. The atmosphere began to slide toward harmless, empty remarks. Lucas stood up. The chair beneath him made a sound loud enough to draw the attention of the entire row. He did not wait for a microphone, yet his voice carried clearly. I have a question. Vance looked down, his gaze sweeping past the older faces before stopping on the young man with the direct stare. Who are you? Vance asked, one eyebrow lifting. I do not recall seeing you in the previous sessions. Lucas Ramirez, he replied, Afghanistan veteran, someone who has been waiting for 2 years. A small ripple of disturbance moved through the room. A few people whispered, recognizing that he had sat silently through all 3 days. Vance clasped his hands together. keeping his tone measured. Very well, Mr. Ramirez, he said. Please share your specific difficulty. Lucas did not hedge. Why are thousands of files being delayed? He asked. Mine is among them. A pen froze on a notepad. Someone from the corporate group muttered under his breath. Backlogged files again. The person next to him shrugged. Closed session. At most. They will placate him and move on. Vance gave a short, dismissive smile. Which files are you referring to? He asked. I cannot answer such a general question. Perhaps your file is missing documents. Perhaps your local office is slow. Perhaps it is missing nothing. Lucas cut in. My file was marked as approved. The Vocational Training Fund recorded it as disbursed. I have letters. I have emails, all stating clearly that the funds have been transferred. For 2 years, there have been no classes, no training programs, no jobs, only promises and automated responses. The room seemed to contract. The words approved and dispersed hung heavily in the sealed air. A gray-haired veteran in the back row stared down at his knees, where a letter bearing the same language was folded, its edges worn. You are telling a personal story, Vance snapped, his hand tightening on the tabletop. We cannot judge an entire system based on a single isolated case. Sit down, and after this session, my team will look into it for you. I am not asking only for myself, Lucas replied. He picked up a plastic folder from his chair and raised it to chest level. This is a list of people marked by the system as dispersed. Just like me, they are still waiting. Some of them are dead. Their names appear in performance reports, but in real life, no one ever calls them back. Murmurs spread across the room. Several people leaned forward, trying to see what was inside. The note-taker hesitated, then began writing rapidly, as if afraid to miss anything. Vance's eyes darkened. Where did you get that material? He asked. Each word clipped. Those are internal records. You have no right to possess them. I have the right to ask why my name is used to prove that money has been spent, Lucas answered, keeping the folder raised. The budget is recorded as dispersed. That is how you log it. So where does the money go, if not to the people on this list? A voice from the back blurted out. That is right. Another spoke louder. My file is also marked as having received support. Plastic chairs creaked. A few arms lifted, and then lowered again, as if fear of being seen still held them back. Vance felt the familiar order beginning to wobble. Mr. Ramirez, I am asking you to sit down, he said, impatience seeping into his voice. This session is not a place for inciting a crowd. Sit down, or you will be required to leave the room. Lucas looked around, meeting eyes filled with both fear and expectation. 2 years of my life have been locked inside the phrase, under review, he said. So have years of the lives of these people. When we ask, you speak of procedures. When we stay silent, you say everything is fine. Tud, oh why we come with your own paperwork, and you call that incitement. The words struck hard. A veteran in the row to the right half stood, then sat back down, fists clenched. A representative from a non-profit organization in the corner stopped typing on her laptop, her eyes fixed on Lucas. Vance turned to the moderator, his jaw twitching. Security, he said, no longer shielding the microphone. 2 security staff members by the door exchanged glances. Then one of them began walking down the aisle between the rows. Lucas knew it was coming. He took a deep breath, holding the folder against his chest. Before they touch me, he said, I want to hear something other than the word procedure. The guard paused briefly, turning to wait for further instruction. The moderator looked at Vance, flustered. The air was so stifling that one wrong move could ignite everything that had built up over 3 days. You are wasting everyone's time, Vance growled. This is a closed meeting, not a performance. Sit down, or you will be forced to leave. Lucas stared straight at him. If even here we are not allowed to ask about money that bears our names, he said, then where is it safe to speak at all? Before the guard could step forward again, the sound of a chair shifting came from the front row. Elias stood up. The movement was ordinary, yet the entire room turned. Elias did not look around. His eyes rested on Vance. Gregory Vance. He called him by name, his voice not loud but firm, like a hammer striking a wall that both men knew had been cracked for a long time. When Elias stood up in the closed meeting room, the scrape of chairs and the whispers stopped completely. The security guard in the aisle halted and turned back toward the head table. Gregory Vance gripped the edge of the table, struggling to maintain a calm expression. Mr. Hawthorne, please sit down. We will address this later, the coordinator said. Elias did not respond. He stepped into the middle of the aisle, lifted his head, and locked his eyes on Vance. For days now, you have talked about transparency, Elias said. So let us talk about a number you thought had been buried. 11, 6, 8. Gregory Vance. A brief wave of murmurs rippled through the room. On the federal oversight row, a female supervisor leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Elias. He rolled up his sleeve. The faded eagle tattoo appeared, with 4 numbers beneath it: 11, 6, 8. Elias raised his wrist to chest level. 1168 is not an achievement, he said. It is the code of a buried report. Vance forced a smile. I do not know what you are talking about, he replied. More than 40 years ago, there were countless reports, but who remembers every code? Besides, this is a meeting about the present, not a place to tell old stories. The past returns when the person who buried it is still sitting in the same chair, Elias said. In November of 68, I submitted the first report on post-war funds being siphoned through shell companies, code 1168. The next day, that code disappeared from the ledger, but I remember the name of the last person who handled it. That was you. The supervisor spoke to her secretary. Check the report code chain from November of 68. See what happened to 1168. The secretary opened her laptop and typed rapidly. Elias opened his briefcase, took out a thin folder, and held it up. This is the copy I managed to keep, he said. Compare it with the archives, and you will see which sections were deleted. Lucas looked at the stack of papers, feeling his own life story suddenly connect with the number on that wrist. He spoke, his voice steadier than ever. If that report had not disappeared, maybe my generation would not have been used as good-looking numbers and then abandoned outside the system. The secretary looked up. In the November 68 code chain, there is one code marked unavailable, exactly at the position of 1168, she said. The system log shows the file was received by the assistant Gregory Vance, after which no content remains. The murmuring rose again, then faded. An elderly veteran crossed his arms and stared directly at Vance. That could have been a technical error. Vance snapped. At that time, I was only an assistant, following assignments. You stayed silent for decades. And now you come here to dump everything on me? Do you call that fair? It is not an error, Elias said. It is a repeating pattern. From 1168 to the list Lucas is holding. The common point is one thing. The money is recorded as having left the fund, while the people whose names are listed received nothing. Lucas raised the plastic folder. These are the people the system marked as dispersed, he said. They are still unemployed, or already buried in veterans' cemeteries, yet their names appear under success on your slides. Another board member asked the secretary, do these names match the summary reports? She looked at the screen and nodded. Yes, many of them. The supervisor took a deep breath and lifted the microphone. Based on what has been presented here, she said, the board cannot continue to assume this program has been properly managed. We hereby declare the temporary suspension of Mr. Gregory Vance from his position as director, pending a federal investigation into Code 1168, the related contracts, and the group of files marked as dispersed but never receiving actual support. Vance sprang to his feet. You are destroying my reputation based on the words of an old man and an unemployed nobody, he shouted. I brought in so much funding, appeared in so many news reports. Have you all forgotten that news reports do not pay rent for the people on this list? Lucas replied, his eyes never leaving Vance. This tattoo is not for showing off, Elias said. It is a reminder that a chance to correct a wrong was buried, and that the silence of that day created the generation whose files are suspended today. The security guard moved toward the head table and stood beside Vance, awaiting orders. This time, no one told them to escort Lucas out. The coordinator looked to the board, then into the microphone. The session is adjourned, he said briefly. Further details will be announced later. Several veterans passed by Lucas and gently squeezed his shoulder. One stopped in front of Elias, nodded, and said quietly, thank you for not letting it sink again. In the hallway, Vance walked between 2 security staff. The name badge on his chest was still there, but no one stopped to shake his hand. Those nearby stepped aside. Elias did not look after him. He returned to a small waiting room, closed his briefcase, placed his tattooed hand on the lid for a few seconds, then lifted it. He exited through a side door of the hotel and blended into the flow of people on the street. Lucas remained in the hallway, gripping the folder tightly. He knew that once he stepped out of the building, he would no longer be a file under review in a nameless system. He was someone who had spoken names aloud, who had held their documents up in front of them, and who had watched a link of power be removed from its place. Do you think a system like this can correct itself? Or must it be exposed down to its roots before it changes? Leave your thoughts, and do not take your eyes off the next stories about those around you who dare to break the silence that once felt safe. If you do not want to miss stories that strip power bare like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on following now, so that next time we expose the system, you will be the first to witness it.